Heian period. And basically what we discussed about the Heian period was, well, a few important things. Was that actually Heian period was a unique period in well, not only in Japan but also in the world, where actually women were mostly the carriers of the arts. So especially women in the very high positions, they dedicated a lot of their time in writing, making music, writing poetry, and this is different from anywhere else in the world, where mostly men engage in these activities. But in Japan, in the Heian era, from a 400-year era, from around 800 BC till 1200 BC, in a time where Europe was in the Middle Ages and the so-called Dark Ages, where literacy was very low, and actually there was a trend of de-conglomeration. In Japan, we already had a city like current-day Kyoto, which had more than 100,000 people, where we had a ruling class that was that left us with a lot of written history, which was of course also a little bit skewed, because the normal class and 99.9% of the rest of Japan didn't leave us these traces, and they were mostly engaged in agriculture. It was a time where there was very little economic progress. The rulers, the owners, basically the ruling class spent a lot of time self-indulging and not really on ruling and creating much progress in Japan. Nonetheless, it was a period where it was a very important period and unique from the female perspective. So this created a very stable society where very few things changed. There was not an awful lot of warfare. So this is a period of stability, and it gives us a very interesting peek into what people at those days were thinking about. Japan was heavily influenced by Chinese culture, especially Buddhist culture, and especially the culture from the Tang Dynasty, which was actually a little bit later than the Chinese. So the Chinese viewed the Japanese as a little bit backwards, copycats, but Japan was doing quite okay. After this, we looked at the Meiji era and the period leading up to the Meiji era. So this was a period where there were many landlords, daimyo. There was a very strict hierarchy in Japan, with the shogun, the daimyo, then above that the samurai class, above that the farmers, then the artisans, the craftspeople, and then the lowest class were the merchants. Much to the frustration of many people in the middle classes, especially the samurai class. The merchants were sometimes thriving and were more prosperous than the samurai. samurai played a very important role. They were engaged in warfare. They were fighters, warriors, highly efficient and strong in combat. And what we discussed actually was what happened after Japan returned to a period of stability in the Meiji era. What happened exactly with the samurai? And we discussed, but I don't think we agreed or concluded about the role of the samurai in the Meiji era. Basically, they were well represented in the military and the bureaucracy, and they formed a very important power block. They have been very important in the Edo era, and were still important in post Edo Japan, but in the military. And one of my assumptions, but is that actually part of this power, part of this thrive of former soldiers had to be channeled, and not being directed inwards Japan, but more outward Japan. So it was my thesis that actually part of the reason why Japan became active outside of its land borders for the first time in hundreds of years of isolation was to actually channel all the pent-up power that had been accumulated within the military as the former samurai actually moved into the military, and that was one of the reasons actually why Japan started to expand after such a long time. But I'm not sure whether we agreed on that, whether this was actually the case. Then we were looking at a movie about the kamikaze pilots during World War II and the tragic history where while Japan was losing the war and they were no longer capable of didn't have enough of the material and the trained people to actually combat with Allied forces, and especially the United States. They nonetheless continued fighting until death, and they raised class of soldiers, the so-called samurai soldiers, soldiers who were trained hastily to fly airplanes with the sole objectives to basically use that airplane as a weapon, and to basically with the objective to inflict harm on the enemy, to protect the motherland from being occupied by the Allied forces. And many kamikaze soldiers actually went into combat with mixed success. Overall, there was very little success. They sometimes managed to inflict damage, but across the board, according to the video that we saw, and this is a one-sided view, but according to that video, we learned that actually the effectiveness of the kamikaze was limited. However, as I learned from history, actually this attitude of the Japanese soldiers, it was, first of all, it was not entirely new. This was also observed in the Russo-Japan War. We also saw references to people who fought until death. But it actually really freaked out the Americans, and one of the explanations that people gave as to why the United States actually started to develop the plans for an atomic bomb was that they were not prepared to suffer the losses due to the samurai, and they were afraid that they were encountered, that the entire Japanese population would be prepared to fight war until death, and they were not prepared to take it that far.
By the way, how do you think about kamikaze at the aspect of like your Westerners?
I've been thinking about that because it's very, very difficult for me to comprehend. Like how can you prepare? How can you find so many people to deliberately and with a plan for months go through training with the sole objective to actually end your own life? This is something that like I was born in peacetime, and I've never never had to live through a war situation. So for me, that's very, very difficult. But then I started to think, like, okay, so how is it actually different from what we see, for example,